Hello there, good morning or indeed good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from. Welcome back to the Panduit Digital Forum, and we're here live from the Panduit CBC in London. Great to be with you, thank you for tuning in. I'm going to be chairing the session for the next half an hour or so today, where we'll be delving into the evolving demands placed on co-location businesses and service providers across the industry. My name's Dan Loosemore. I'm the COO at Data Center Dynamics. We inform and connect the data center industry globally. If you don't know us, give us a quick follow on datacenterdynamics.com. That's the only pitch I'll make for the next 30 minutes or so. Let's allow our panelists, our esteemed panel, far more expert than myself, to introduce themselves. If I start with yourself, David.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to Panduit for inviting me to be here today. So I'm really happy to be here. First event without masks, first event in fact in a year. My name's David Hall. I'm a Senior Fellow for Technology Innovation at Equinix, and we're one of the world's largest co-location providers, so super excited to share some of our thoughts with everyone today.
Thank you, David. Emma?
Hi, I'm Emma Fryer from techUK. Again, like David, delighted to be here, so thanks for the opportunity. I look after the data centre sector and I essentially provide a collective voice for our UK operators. As I said, I work for techUK. We're a broad-based digital technology trade association, and I really sit between the industry and government, which is kind of between a rock and a hard place.
And good morning. My name's Michael Akinla. I'm one of the network managers for Panduit within the UK and Ireland. So it's a pleasure to be here with the panels and live, which is nice as well. So it's been a very nicely run session. We've got everybody here supporting us, so it's a pleasure to be talking to you guys live as well.
Thank you all. Great to be here chairing you. I'm not scrolling through my Instagram, by the way. I'm just keeping an eye on the questions coming in from the digital feed. Keep sending them in. We'll get through as many as we can in the allotted time today. Emma, I'm going to give you the unenviable position of kicking us off. We're seeing a continued increase in the size and scale of deployments, the need for capacity, particularly over the last 18 months or so with the pandemic. Maybe you can talk to some of those changes and colo expectations as you see them and give us some context for how you're seeing the market shift here.
Okay, so in general and sort of contextually, I am seeing two things. One is a lot bigger than the other. The first is that the pandemic has driven an increase in requirement from traditional enterprise or people who thought they would never outsource and now realise they need to outsource because having their stuff in a server room in a building they can't access is maybe not such a great idea after all. So there's an uplift in demand from that. Then the big change is obviously the growth in demand from cloud. Largely, I think the last figures I saw said over 90% of that new growth for new developments being driven by large cloud service providers. And they are a totally different kind of customer, sophisticated, they know exactly what they want, they've built stuff out before, and they're needing things at speed and scale that we've not seen before. So we're seeing fewer developments, but much, much larger in scale. And obviously that's meaning, because they want them very tightly clustered, that we're going to start seeing constraints on availability of space, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that later in specific areas. But yeah, totally different kind of customer, really interesting to see, and it's driving a rate of growth that I don't think we've seen for a while in the industry. Perhaps never.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Absolutely. And I think the stat the other day that DCD uncovered was 50% of that colo demand now coming from the hyperscale and cloud sides. It's making a big impact there in terms of demand drivers. Michael, interesting to get your perspective from slightly different part of the ecosystem on the vendor side. How are you seeing these demand challenges and evolving expectations here?
Well, I mean, from our perspective, I guess if you're looking at building anything at scale, we've, from time immemorial, when we've, as engineers, built, we've always built big, because the bigger you build, you keep your costs down, you're able to affect what you're buying, your buying power improves, and you have greater efficiencies in terms of deployment and the like. So that's a clear given, and that's very, very exciting. From our perspective, as Emma was quite rightly saying, and you just pointed out as well, we have huge growth, huge demand across the piece, from a gaming perspective, working from home, accessing these providers across the board. So, that's a very, very exciting piece. And where does it go for the future? From our perspective, we've been extremely lucky. As a business, we were fortunate enough to be categorized as one of the keep open type enterprises across the globe. So, we have grown as the cloud providers, the hyperscalers, the MTDCs like Equinix have grown. We have grown with them, and we've had to evolve our business practices to, quite frankly, being able to keep up with the demand that's coming from these great providers.
Thanks, Michael. And David, obviously you're here to give that sort of native perspective. How are you seeing it from the colo side? I know you have offerings specific to some of those big hyperscale clients and also enterprise. How are you seeing these shifts?
Yeah, so I think what we saw during COVID was nothing really changed. Maybe there was a kind of acceleration of things that we sort of expected to happen over the next 4 or 5 years, and suddenly people wanted those things to happen over the next 1 or 2 years. So the kind of big things, I guess, are, as Emma alluded to, the kind of hyperscale demand, more and more moving to the public cloud, customers looking to take advantage of things like machine learning on big data sets, and public cloud really providing a fantastic environment to support those kinds of applications. Customers saying, well, my staff are not all concentrated in one office in Canary Wharf anymore, so does it make sense for me to concentrate my kind of back office IT in that environment? Probably not, because if I look at the kind of flows of network traffic, I've now got users all over the world. I've got users, kind of working from home, users working from trains, users really everywhere. So I think that this was something we started to see anyway, which was customers saying, well, okay, if I co-locate my environment with someone like an Equinix, then I've got that access into the public cloud, I've got access into network. Both of those things are kind of super important in an environment where I've got staff, in locations that I can't predict. So I think kind of almost nothing new for Equinix, but the velocity of that change kind of really accelerated, and I think that's really what we saw this year during COVID. And then Emma alluded to again that kind of speed at which those transactions are being executed, again just much faster, a demand to do things quicker. And I think one of the big challenges, and we'll probably come on to it, is how we and others in our space respond to that. Customers kind of 6 months to get structured cabling installed and get the IT installed is way too slow now. And I think the kind of big challenge for us and the opportunity for folks in our space is how do we kind of support that transformation? How do we do it more quickly in more places, and kind of remove some of that burden from our end customers?
No, that's great. Thank you. And I think you've all mentioned the speed. Emma, you talked a little bit about some of those power constraints or space constraints. David, from your perspective as a colo, speed wins in some cases, but how else have requirements shifted? There's maybe greater flexibility in capacity than was previously the case. How are colos differentiating themselves so the data center doesn't become a commodity or isn't seen as a commodity from enterprises looking to outsource or even from the hyperscalers outsource?
So I think a lot of it is, there's a lot of stuff that's great about colo that you can't really do anywhere else. So the control of the whole stack, the flexibility to partner with technology providers of your choice and kind of shuffle in and out technology providers quickly. There's always been a demand for customers to do that, right? And the ability to do that is much greater than you can achieve in a public cloud. The question is, how do you do that? So I'm going to kind of think about this from an Equinix perspective, and that's kind of reasonable, I guess, given where I work. So one of the things that we got from our customers is that they really wanted access to kind of physical infrastructure. They loved the idea of being able to run their complete stack on physical infrastructure, but they weren't so bothered about who physically came along and installed the servers. So a lot of the investment that Equinix has been making is how can we bring Metal, which is what we call at Equinix, how can we bring kind of servers and network as a service to our customers so that rather than them having to send their own engineers in, we can kind of make available physical infrastructure platforms really at the speed of public cloud. So we invested last year in a company called Packet, it's now Equinix Metal, and what that means for customers, they can do exactly what they always did. They can have physical servers in Equinix and they can choose Dell or HP or whoever their particular favorite manufacturer of server is, but they can do that with a software overlay that enables them to kind of deploy super rapidly. So that's a real significant shift for us, right? And and I think other folks are approaching that in different ways. We're also seeing much much the same on the network platform as well. So customers saying, we don't have the experience of building out these big wide area networks, do it for us. Right, we want someone to provide security as a service. We want someone to provide wide area networking as a service. So again, those are areas where Equinix is saying, okay, we can provide a software overlay, we can provide the physical infrastructure as a service, and then we can give that to customers in a way that they can consume it kind of halfway between colo and halfway between public cloud. And I think that's certainly how we're looking to solve that at Equinix.
Great. And we're going to be delving into the data center of the future a little bit later on as well. Check that out in your agendas. Michael, maybe I'll come back to you. So we've just heard how those customer requirements are changing for the Equinixes of the world. How are you seeing your customer requirements change in terms of working with the co-location businesses or enterprises? How's that impacting Panduit's service and how are you meeting those demands?
Well, they've been very demanding. I think that's the long and the short of it. But from our perspective, it's great. And Dave's talked about speed of deployment, and I think one of the key things that MTDCs, Equinix are trying to do, you could look at your Amazons, your Microsoft, is consistency. That platform and consistency is absolutely key, not only for their business operations but for their customers as well. So their customers know exactly what they're going to be getting. And from what we bring to the picture, working with the likes of Equinix, is we would bring that consistency in terms of the product delivery and working with them to ensure that they know when, as they're growing and expanding, they can have pre-configured elements coming into their setup that we are doing in our factories, which are controlled in a solid environment, so that we can roll that into their environment without them having to do that in situ. So ultimately they can focus on what they do well, which is offering the great services that they're putting out there into the marketplace. We deliver the infrastructure a bit more pre-configured, a bit more thought going into it. It comes onto site and it's ready to go.
Yeah, and then accelerating deployments and also allowing each part of the ecosystem to focus on those core competencies.
We don't want their intelligent hands working on a product that we're good at working at. We can do that ourselves, and we can allow them to focus on what they want to do.
Great stuff, thank you. Some really interesting questions coming in. The first one, and I think you touched upon security, is around comfort levels of who owns the data. Is there data privacy concerns? How does that work now that we're in a sort of hybrid IT world? David, I might come to you first on that and then come back to Emma to look at regulation a little more broadly.
Yes, I think the first is location, right? So, there's a sense that by choosing to host my data in a kind of environment that I understand, in a country that's I'm regulated in, I have that kind of comfort that I understand the kind of regulatory space and also physically what's happening with my data. The second one is how much of the stack do I control, right? So if I outsource the storage of my data to a third party and they're providing kind of database as a service, to what extent are they also able to either leverage that data or leverage metadata to kind of build their own competing platforms potentially? So I think that's one of the key drivers for customers who want to consume kind of physical infrastructure. It is around the regulatory space and the kind of ability to demonstrate to my regulators as an end customer that I have control of this complete stack. So that's certainly one of the drivers that we see that kind of edges customers into more of a kind of physical infrastructure style of deployment versus the cloud. It is certainly data privacy. I think Emma's probably kind of got the most sophisticated kind of regulatory kind of view of this.
I'm not sure, I'm not a data protection expert, but there are some fairly clear parameters, I think. Your personal data is your data, and that is set out very, very clearly in GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which we are still under in the UK. That is actually also relatively clear in the way it allocates responsibilities. Obviously, you are either a data controller or a data processor, but both have responsibilities, and the level of responsibility depends upon what control you have over that data. So if you're a wholesale colo provider, you only really have the ability to mess up in terms of infrastructure. You'll never get anywhere close to the data. Whereas if you are, in a cloud environment or doing a service for somebody, then you are definitely a data controller. And so it's about, and the levels of responsibility are actually quite clearly allocated. And what we want to see is to make sure that nobody is requiring people lower down that chain to take on responsibilities they're not legally required to do. So that's something to keep an eye on.
and the comfort level of that seems to be increasing as people get more used to having workloads, some on-prem, some in the cloud, some in colo. It's becoming, I think, more the norm, certainly from the DCD perspective. Great question coming in around the business model shifts that all of this demand's creating, particularly around build-to-suit solutions versus retail, wholesale colo, and that data center as a commodity question that we maybe touched upon a little bit. So who wins this race? How do you meet the needs of this quite varied ecosystem? Maybe I'll come back to the Equinix voice there first of all.
Well, Equinix announced a couple of days ago, a significant investment in our xScale business, which essentially is our build-to-suit business for hyperscalers. So we're investing almost another $4 billion of capital with our partners GIC into kind of building out these facilities. But actually, what's really exciting in Equinix perspective is that that business is just great by itself, right? But by doing that, it enhances our relationship with our CSP customers. It enables us to have a much deeper level of dialogue with those CSP customers in our retail business, because actually in our retail business is where our enterprise customers meet those cloud providers, right? So by engaging in the kind of large-scale build-to-suit deployments, it actually gives us this really kind of unique insight into what the CSPs are doing, where they're doing it, and it enables us to support their business in our retail sites, which is where our enterprise and our network customers meet those CSPs. So I think from an Equinix perspective, doing both is super exciting. And then from a technology perspective, we're obviously trying to look for opportunities to take technologies that we develop in our retail business or in our xScale business and apply them across the board. So I can give an example. We developed our own alternative to traditional crack units, something called thermal wall, which originally we built for our xScale business. But actually we're more and more seeing an opportunity to kind of deploy that in our retail co-location sites. We looked at, and we just announced in SV11 for the first time, we're using fuel cell platform as our primary power supply. So that's again a technology that we'd really taken from our xScale business. We developed along with our CSP customers and said actually this is a great home for this in our retail business. I think who the winners will be, well, I'd say one of the big advantages is doing that at scale in our xScale business is obviously the kind of the ability to do that also at scale in our retail business. I think it will become harder and harder to compete if you're only operating in the kind of low margin, hyperscale kind of business, or conversely, you're only operating in a kind of retail colo business and you're not doing the volumes, because volumes obviously ultimately equal the kind of cost of building out this stuff. But more importantly, they equal the operational experience that you gain. And if we're operating 3x the number of data centers or 3x the number of capacity as anyone else, it's harder and harder, I think, for kind of non-specialist colo providers to compete, I think, in that space.
What's the impact of the edge on that sort of competition and need for differentiation and specialisation? How do you see
It's like a Hunter S. Thompson quote about the edge, which I have in my emails, which says something along the lines of no one really knows what the edge is because anyone that's ever kind of gone over it has never come back to tell you. Look, I think it's a really exciting new space, there's a big question about what the edge really is, right? So I remember kind of 15, 20 years ago in London, we talk about the edge as being like essentially 3 data centres in the Docklands, and then that's kind of evolved to encompass a whole bunch of other data centres, and they all are edges in some way. If I spoke to like an Apple or someone, they'd probably say the edge actually existed on my mobile phone. So I think that there's a whole variety of different edges that are interesting. I think there is an indication that some kind of capabilities around 5G capabilities and some of the use cases that you might expect those kind of capabilities to support things like vehicle-to-vehicle kind of communications and stuff where you're going to want this ultra-low latency. I think there is an argument to say that will drive a kind of a new edge, so probably smaller data centers of kind of 200 kilowatts, 500 kilowatts. But no one's really doing that. And there's a whole bunch of folks talking about it. There is money going into that space. I think, kind of hold that thought really, and it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next year or two. But I think really all those things are going to be compatible with each other. There's always going to be a need for these super kind of huge hyperscale campuses. There's always going to be a need for the kind of Equinix, I guess, locations where those hyperscale campuses meet networks and enterprises. And arguably there could be some future need for these smaller edge locations, but yet to be proven, I think.
I know I said no more pitching, but if you do want to learn more about edge business models, check out DCD Building the Edge on Demand. Michael, I guess in terms of serving all those different customers that we were just speaking to, innovation remains the order of the day.
Yes.
For Panduit, maybe you can speak to how those requirements are being met with some of the things that you've had to bring to market, or how do you meet those edge demands and the hyperscale demands and the Equinix demands? How are you responding to those challenges?
Well, I think from our perspective, it goes back to maybe a little bit about what Emma and David were saying. I think that the key thing is access to finance. The people who have money are the people who are going to be able to innovate and drive these interesting changes and demands that are coming forward. And as you go forward and learn from the various aspects of whether it's a colo, MTDC, whether it's an edge, you're learning all the time, and that's the innovation that drives this particular business that we're all in. And from our perspective, we're constantly looking at ways that we can increase that speed of deployment, high capacity, high quality, managing the air, getting the efficiency into the actual, whether it's a hyperscale, whether it's an MTDC, is absolutely key, because it drives down the energy usage, which is key from an environmental point of view. And then if you look at where we are from an edge perspective, we're looking at those self-contained units, being able to roll that out into an environment where, say, for example, an Equinix may want to, rather than having an MTDC in a central location, they may want to have a small edge type MTDC that's located on-prem, that's in an environment which is closer to the customer, so that they can get those latency benefits, those on-ramp benefits, which are absolutely key. And that may not be sitting in an Equinix facility. It may be going out to a more remote location. But having the technology that wraps around you so that you know how to manage the security, manage the cooling, manage the power, and all of those different aspects is absolutely what we are driving for.
You talked about the environmentals there. The question's coming in. We can't talk about evolving colo demands without talking about sustainability. We've seen aggressive pledges from the hyperscalers towards net zero, or in some cases net positive. Yeah. How do you see sustainability as a differentiator, as a USP, or indeed is it now going to become table stakes? Emma, I'll come to you first on this one. Yeah.
I mean, it's not a differentiator, it's a prerequisite. And I think there's a number of things we need to look at here. One is transparency. So, particularly as we move, there's an awful lot of speculative and not very well-informed opinion out there about data centre energy use. We know what it is in the UK. We know the co-location, the commercial sector uses 3.6 terawatt hours a year, just under 1% of the UK electricity demand and about 0.3% of the total energy demand. It does a lot for that, an awful lot more than other sectors that are much more energy intensive. So, we are quite carbon productive. But actually, what's unclear is that many of the models, the business models, particularly at the consumer end, are freemium or advertorial. So the consumer, the end user, doesn't have a signal of the carbon impact of their internet activity. So they don't know what that is. So actually increasing that transparency and that awareness, often, they just need to know, and also what it's replacing is important. So I think it's all about, yes, we have to be optimally efficient. We have to be optimally transparent. We have to use the same consistent terminology and make sure we're reporting in similar ways. I think we're not bad about that. I think there is a role for the big players to do that bleeding edge of development, the expensive stuff, the trying out the fuel cells, the sinking data centres into the oceans, to do the things that are, other people will have to follow in their wake. So they're doing that, and I think there's an important role for them there. But it's a prerequisite. There's no two ways about it. But we also have to keep in mind the relative thing. What are we doing for this? What is our carbon productivity? Are we doing things that are spurious, and how do we manage those? Those are the kind of questions that we're going to continue to ask. And there's a lot also that we need to look at in terms of the end user device thing. So we have to look at which different parts of ICT are using energy and how that's changing over time, because it's incredibly dynamic.
David, I'll come to you on this. Are we measuring the right things? Has the emphasis on PUE been correct?
Yeah, well, no, I don't think we are. I think that there are big changes coming, certainly with regards to PUE. So, one of the areas that we'll probably talk about this a bit later, so I'll preview it now, is water cooling. So the first job I ever did in data centres was ripping out a water cooling system, and I'm now spending my life putting water back into data centres. But one of the perverse things about water cooling is that as soon as you remove the fans from your devices, your PUE is going to go up. So the amount of useful work you get out of your data centre is going to go up, which is good. So relative, your carbon intensity goes down, but your PUE goes up. So that's an obvious example where PUE is just failing. I think there's, for Equinix, for example, we moved to 90% plus renewables across the group. That's brilliant. But, we're still leaking out a load of refrigerants that are causing harm to the atmosphere. So that's not good, right? And no one's really talking about fluorinated hydrocarbons, right? Everyone should be talking about them because they're destroying the atmosphere. They've got global warming potentials much higher than CO2, and they've got half-lives much higher than CO2, but no one's talking about them. So, I think we've got to get a bit more serious as an industry. I think there's an element of people saying the right thing, but, is it really the right thing? It looks good on paper, it looks good to an unsophisticated audience, but actually behind the scenes, really, there's more that we can be doing. So I think I agree with everything that Emma said. I think, for folks like Equinix and the hyperscalers, we really have to lead, and we have to be honest and open about what we're doing and where it's successful so others can follow us, and where it's unsuccessful we should also be open and honest so others don't follow us. And the great thing is, forums like techUK are a great way of opportunity for operators to have those honest discussions with each other, and everyone benefit from them. So it's real because, hey, we want to run a sustainable business, we want to be here in 50 years time, and if there's no planet Earth, the's no point. So that's the reason for doing it.
Michael, maybe it's fitting, as we're here in the CBC, to give Panduit the final word for this panel and indeed on sustainability here.
From our perspective, the approach we would take is controlling the effectiveness within these data center environments. So we're looking at dynamic smart cooling. We're looking at ways of making sure that we can control the airflow in there. We're looking at EPDs, environmental product declarations, in terms of how we make our products and how we ship our products, so that we can get all of these metrics out to the people that are actually going to be installing and using the products. Because ultimately, from our perspective, it's key. We have manufacturing sites that we have to get to net zero on. We have to make the product in the right way and actually make sure it's contributing to this sustainability argument as well.
Thank you ever so much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. It's absolutely flown by. Hopefully for everyone tuning in as well. Big thanks to Panduit for hosting us, and of course to David, to Emma, to Michael for being here and being our experts today. There's a fantastic choice of breakout sessions. I think you've got 3 to choose from now, so take a look at the agenda, dive in, they're in front of you on your console, don't miss them. And we'll see you in an hour or so for a bit more of a Q&A. So thanks for tuning in, thanks for being with us, and enjoy the breakout sessions. Thank you, goodbye.
Thanks, Dan.